I'm going to speak about tonight the Yontif, the holiday of Rosh Hashana. Why is it important to speak about a Yontif, a holiday itself? If you take a look around, you'll notice that many people, when they celebrate a Yontif, they do so in a very superficial manner. It's surface. What does that mean? What is the major way most people celebrate a holiday? What they do is they engage in eating, they daven, they engage in eating, sleeping, and so on. And in many ways, this is their relationship to the holiday itself. In many ways, even though it's important to be joyous, but in many ways, the celebration itself is superficial. It's surface. Every holiday in the Jewish calendar has a tremendous pnimius. It has a tremendous internal understanding. And it is that internal understanding that can give a person tremendous spiritual growth. To the extent that a person understands what a holiday is, what the Yom Tov really is, to that extent, he can grow spiritually. It's unfortunate that many people, their understanding of a Jewish holiday is fundamentally surface, which means that they only understand the historical event itself. What occurred, for instance, by Pesach? What occurred in Pesach? Well, we know Yetzias Mitzrayim, the exodus from Egypt. As a result of that, they know the story, and they try to commemorate it, but the truth is that Pesach has a much greater, much more profound understanding, a greater meaning. And if a person is able to connect with that meaning, what that means is that he's able to realize much greater ruchnius, much greater spiritual growth. Therefore, what I would like to do tonight is to talk about Rosh Hashana, but not on a surface level. To go into what exactly is Rosh Hashana all about. And I'm hoping that that understanding is going to allow everybody to experience a much greater growth from Rosh Hashana and to be able to engage in the Yontif with much greater clarity and practicality. Toward that end, I'm going to try to ask a series of questions, and hopefully these questions will dramatize to everyone that when we really think about Rosh Hashanah, what it really means, we will see that we don't really understand it. Based on the questions that I will ask, we will see that we really have a surface understanding of what Rosh Hashanah is. And it's my objective tonight to try to answer that, to try to give you some type of an impression, but a profound impression really of what happens on Rosh Hashanah. The first question I would like to ask, you will find that every single holiday in the Jewish calendar is related to some historical event in Judaism itself, in Jewish history. Take a look at every one. You have what? Let's start from Nisan. Pesach is of course about the Yetzias Mitzrayim, the Exodus itself. Shavuos is about the giving of the Torah. Tisha B'Av is about the destruction of the temples. You have Sukkot, which is either about them, the fact that the Jews were in huts during the desert, or because of the clouds that surrounded the Jews. Hanukkah is about, of course, the miracle of Hanukkah, the Ner Hanukkah. Purim is about the story of Ahasuerus and Haman and Esther and Mordechai. Every single holiday that we commemorate is in some way tied to a historical event that actually occurred in Judaism. The one exception seems to be Rosh Hashana. Rosh Hashana is not tied to any type of historical event. That's a very interesting concept. What does that mean? What does it mean that Rosh Hashana is not tied to a historical Jewish event? Is Rosh Hashana then a real deviation from that rule? Or not really? That is the first question I want to leave you with. What is the connection between the date or the holiday of Rosh Hashana and the events that occur in Jewish history? That is the first question. A second question: what really happens on Rosh Hashana? You may say to me, what do you mean what happens? It's a judgment day. It's Yom Hadin. And this is what it says. We see all through the Tefillah that it's Yom Hadin. But what I would like to suggest is that it's much more profound than Yom Hadin. It is not the average type of Yom Hadin where a person goes to court to find out what's going to happen to him. As you will see later, the concept of Yom Hadin on Rosh Hashanah is really very different in meaning. Another question that I would like to ask is that if Rosh Hashanah is really Yom Hadin, then the question is, why does it happen once a year? Who ever heard of a judgment day happening once a year? A judgment day should occur every day, right? Person, he does a sin, there should be a judgment. You don't put off a judgment day for a year later. That's unheard of. I mean, it's one thing about the English courts where they have no choice. You know, they put it off because their calendar is so filled. But that's not true of the Rabbanu Shalom. In fact, the Mishnah says that the Rabbanu Shalom judges the entire creation simultaneously in one instant. Beskira achas, the Mishnah says. He judges everything in one simultaneously and in an instant. So clearly then, the Rabbanu Shalom doesn't have problems with his calendar. So if that's the question, Rosh Hashanah, or rather Yom Hadin, should really occur every day, not once a year. In fact, the whole concept of a judgment day being determined by time doesn't make sense. It should be determined by Maaseh Odom, by the acts of a person, because that's what the judgment is about. It's about the acts that a person did. So what does it mean that it's time determined? It happens once a year. That time determines when the judgment occurs. It should be the act that occurs that determines the Yom Hadin. That's also a question. Another question. Why is the judgment day, which is the event that occurs in Rosh Hashanah, why does it happen on the first day of Tishrei? What is the internal connection between the event of Yom Hadin and the first day of Tishrei, which is Rosh Hashana, the first day of the year? Is there an internal connection? That is my question. Then there's another question. We find, it says in the Masana Toikef, and you see that everything is judged on Rosh Hashanah. Everything. As it says in the Masana Toikef, that everything is judged. Kol bo'olam means every creature that exists is judged on Rosh Hashanah. Even the Malachim are judged. Even they are judged. So the question is, what does that mean? I can understand that there's a judgment on somebody that has bechira, that has free will. If a person has free will and he does something, a sin, then he is held responsible. There's a culpability, there's a guilt because he had free will, and therefore he's responsible. But why is everything judged? Most things, especially living creatures that are whatever, animals or whatever, there's no culpability. You can't hold guilty a lion that decides to kill a human being. That's its nature. It doesn't distinguish between good or bad, right or wrong. So why is everything judged? It should be just mankind is judged. That's another question. Now, besides this, there's something very strange that is going on. I'm sure that it occurred to some people. Imagine, what does a person do on Rosh Hashanah? He sits down and he has a tremendous su'udah, festive meal. He has a meal, perhaps they sing zmiris. He enjoys the company of what? Of his kids, the relatives, whatever. It's a simcha. It's a happy time. Why would a person be eating and celebrating if it wasn't a happy time? So therefore, if somebody walked over to you, if some guy came over to you and looked at the suda, people eating, he would say, very nice, What's the occasion? And what do you say? Well, I'll tell you something. You know what the occasion is? Everybody's being judged whether they'll live or die. What do you think he would do? He'd say, what, are you crazy? Live or die? They're celebrating here, and the occasion for the celebration is because they're being judged if they will live or die? He'd be shocked. What does that mean? Because it's completely incompatible. The behavior that we do on Rosh Hashanah is incompatible. It doesn't jive with what we know about Rosh Hashanah. That the swarm of Chaim V'Amovis lies before the Rebbe Shalom, and as it says, who will die, maybe Kitzoy, and so on, maybe Rov, who will become poor or rich, and so on and so forth. That's a terrible type of judgment. A person who is judged in a court of law, and he's on a murder charge, do you think that he's on that day of judgment, he's going to go home and have a meal, festive meal? Of course not. The behavior is incompatible. People should be unbelievably anxious in terms of what the outcome of the judgment is. We don't do that. So the question is, how can we say that Rosh Hashanah is a Yom HaDin when what we do on Rosh Hashanah has nothing to do with Din? In fact, it's completely contradictory to the whole concept of a judgment day. So the question is, how do we understand this apparent contradiction? Clearly there must be something else going on. What is it? Not only that, but there's a medrash that says the Malachim, the angels, they said to the Rebbe Shalom, well, since it's a Yom Tov, a holiday, why not say Hallel? Hallel. Could you imagine that? Saying Hallel on Yom HaDin. So the Rebbe Shalom answers the Malachim and he says to them, well, since the books of life and death are opened in front of them, it's not appropriate to say Hallel. Because there has to be a tremendous rejoicing, joy, simcha, for Hallel to be said. Now, the question is, what kind of a conversation is this? The Rebbe Shalom is telling them, since the books are open, therefore what? As a result of that, they cannot say Hallel? So then what are they eating a Suda Simcha for? Why are they doing that? And the Rebbe Shalom is telling the Malachim something they didn't know? They also know that the books of life and death are open. So what's his answer to these Malachim? That's the question. Each of these questions is really a very powerful question. It brings into doubt the entire essence of the day. Or at least it tells us that we don't really understand what is going on. Also, in terms of the logic of the presentation, when we daven on Musaf, there's a certain series of themes that we cover in the Tefillah. One of them is called Malchias. In Musaf, we say psukim, verses that talk about that the fact that the Rebbe Shalom is a melech, he's a king. That's the first series of verses, psukim. Then we have a second series of psukim, zichronos, where we ask the Rebbe Shalom to do what? To remember the good things, the tremendous chus of the Avos, and maybe as a result of that, maybe that'll help us in judgment. Then there's a third series of psukim that we read, which has no theme, which it has a theme, but it has no meaning. We quote different psukim about shofar, about the concept of blowing shofar. First of all, what does that have to do with our plea? Shofar. What does shofar have to do with our plea? That's the question. And what is this series of ideas? That leads me to another question. The concept of shofar. What is the meaning of shofar? Is there any way we can understand it? This is the question. Not only that, but there's a famous Gemara that says that the shofar is ma'arvev the Satan. It confuses him. Now, the difficulty with that is that every Rosh Hashana we blow shofar. And since Matan Torah, we've had 3,300 different Rosh Hashanahs. One would think that the Satan can figure out that we're going to blow shofar on Rosh Hashanah. So then the question is, what does it mean? What does it mean that the Satan becomes confounded or confused because of what happens on Rosh Hashanah? Why? By now he should have gotten it. This is the question. Another idea is that the Gemara says, why do we blow Tekiah, Shvarim, and Trua? We have three different sounds. One sound is the Tekiah, which is a long blast. And this resembles crying. There are three types of crying. Yololo. One type of crying is when a person wails. It's a long blast. That's a Tekiah. A second is called a Shever. And that's sort of like a sigh. It's a break of three. And then there's a staccato cry, where a person just breaks down because he cannot hold it in. Therefore, the tekiyas of a shofar are of three types. What does it mean that there are three types? Because there are three types of crying. So the question that we can ask is, why are there, or rather, why does the sounds of the shofar have to resemble crying? This is the question. And the final question I'd like to ask is that the Gemara says clearly that the Akedah is centrally involved in Rosh Hashanah. We read the Akedah on Rosh Hashanah. And the question is why? What does the Akedah have to do with Rosh Hashanah? I mean, we know the Akedah is a tremendous merit that the Jews had because Avraham Avinu decided, or he was commanded to slaughter his son Yitzchak. But what is the connection? Is there an intrinsic connection between the Akedah and Rosh Hashanah? I have asked many questions. Each of these questions in themselves are very strong. And what the questions do is they point to the fact that we really have a tremendous deficiency in understanding what Rosh Hashanah really is. Therefore, what I'd like to do is to discuss these ideas, Rosh Hashanah, to try to tell you what really Rosh Hashanah is. In fact, what I'm going to try to do is to answer all these questions, and by the way, there were 12 of them, for those who are counting, to answer them with one answer. Not 12 different answers for 12 questions, but one answer. And that answer is the true meaning of Rosh Hashanah, and it answers all the questions. Okay, what then is the true meaning of Rosh Hashanah? In order to understand that, we have to understand certain ideas about the creation itself. The Rebbeinu Shalom created the world. Why? Why would the Rebbeinu Shalom create the world? And the answer is very simple. The reason why he created the world is to bestow, to give an infinite state of pleasure to a human being. This is what our Chazal tell us. That's why the Rebbeinu Shalom created everything. To take a human being and to give him an infinite state of pleasure. The Rebbeinu Shalom decided that this pleasure that he would give this person would not be a gift. It would not be b'chinam. It would rather be avodah, not b'matana. It's not a gift. It's avodah. A person has to work for this gift. For this, actually, it's a reward, because it's a reward because you have to expend efforts in order to receive this tremendous state of bliss. So the decision is that a person has to work in order to receive this. What is the task that a person has to do? Clearly the Rebbeinu Shalom has to designate a task, or what's the whole point? So what the Rebbeinu Shalom does is the task that he designates for people is that he will require people to gain an understanding of the true nature of reality. What is the true nature of reality? That there is a spiritual universe, and that is the fundamental underpinning of the physical. And not only that, but the underpinning of the spiritual universe is God himself, is the Rebbeinu Shalom himself. What the Rebbeinu Shalom wants is that a person recognize what the relationship is between the Rebbeinu Shalom and the existence itself. What does that mean? That means that the Rebbeinu Shalom created a place, and that's what Olam Hazeh is, this world, where he removed himself. He removed his presence. He concealed himself. This is what he did. And what the Rebbeinu Shalom wants is that he wants to re-enter creation. And the only way he will do that is if people declare that he exists and he is the supreme ruler. Then the Rebbeinu Shalom re-enters creation. That concept, where the Rebbeinu Shalom created a situation in which he is absent, that's called a chesaron, a deficiency. Therefore, it is the job of mankind, and certainly the job of the Jews, to bring the Rebbeinu Shalom back, where the Rebbeinu Shalom will then be revealed. That concept is called tikkun, correction, restoration, rectification, whatever, any one of those words. Therefore, it is the task of man, specifically the Jews, to misake, to rectify the creation. And that is done by bringing the Rebbeinu Shalom back. And the one who does that, of course, is the Mashiach himself. As a result of the avodah, the work of the Jews themselves. Therefore, the Rebbeinu Shalom wants that all Jews should work to bring him back into creation. When it happens, then the tikkun, the rectification, will have been said to have occurred. The total rectification will have occurred, and that's called tikkun hakloli, the general or total rectification of the universe. This is the plan of God. This is what he essentially wants, for man to do this. Therefore, he created this world in order for that to be done. Therefore, we see that the concept of a person that can allow God to re-enter creation is this person has the power of tikkun. He has the power to bring God back into the creation. If he sins, then the reverse happens. He pushes God outside creation. He pushes him back away. It's an opposite effect. Therefore, a person who can do this is called a masakin or a makalkel. Either he can bring God back, and that's tikkun, or he can push God out, and that's kilkul, that is damage. This is what the Rebbeinu Shalom, this is the plan of creation. This is what the Rebbeinu Shalom has done. Now, if this is the case, we can now understand something. If you look at the total acts of the Rebbeinu Shalom, his actions, they can be understood in several categories. All the actions that the Rebbeinu Shalom does in order to set up the experiment, the test, this is called the anhog of kiyum. It's the anhoga, which means the actions that God takes to bring about the fulfillment of his desires, which is the plan itself. This is this concept, this category. What are the actions in that category that the Rebbeinu Shalom takes to bring about the fulfillment of the plan? Well, first he creates the universe. He creates all creatures in it. Not only that, but he gives each person a specific task in the overall task of doing the tikkun. This is what the Rebbeinu Shalom does. Now it's interesting. The totality of the different jobs that a person has to do is distributed through all Jews. And it's based on the type of neshama that you have. Each neshama determines the type of setting or background that he has to be in. For instance, there are certain people that their task is to be wealthy. And in that wealth, they have to either give charity, they have to not be arrogant, they have to be humble, they have to be compassionate to others, even though wealth would seem to blind them. Because their neshama is a certain type that demands that task. Some other people have different tasks. Sometimes a neshama is such where it has to be poor. And in poverty it has to choose what to do. What does that mean? The neshama itself, a poor man, has his own set of temptations. He can complain bitterly against his situation. Or he can feel that nothing will ever happen, no simcha. In whatever situation a person is in, there's always a set of tasks that a person is given. It's interesting that if a person is not satisfied with his situation, and he'd rather have another situation, for instance, a poor person, he'd rather be a rich person, the truth is that's very bad. Why? Because based on what his neshama is, and what his area that he has to do tikkun, that he has to rectify, he cannot be wealthy. And if he is, then what happens is that nothing happens. Basically, he's created for nothing. And that's one of the ideas that Chazal say. Ezeu Osher, who is a wealthy man, Hasamech Bechelkoi. Somebody who is what? Who rejoices in his lot. Why? Why is that Ashiris? You go over to a poor guy and you say, well, you're Osher, you should rejoice in your portion. He'll tell you, what, are you crazy? I'd rather have his. But the answer is something which is very fascinating. The answer is that the only way that this individual can gain Ashiris, which is real reward in the future world, is Chelkoi, his situation. If he tries to do another situation, it won't work. Only the Rebbe Hashem knows what's called the range that this person can move into and be useful and do whatever he has to do. That's the concept of Ashiris and the concept of Sameach B'Chelkoi. That's why a person cannot be jealous of another person. Because if you want to engage in that person's area, it's not for you. It's like you take a violin string off a violin. Imagine, you take the violin string off a violin, and what do? You put it on some kind of a radio. It's useless there. A violin string has only purpose and meaning and function when it's on a violin. Same concept with the neshama. And the neshama can only operate in a certain narrow band of avodah. You take that away, and it's useless. It cannot do the tikkun. That's why you really can't be jealous of anybody's situation. In any case, what the Rebbe Hashem does is that he sets up the creation, creates everybody's background, and he gives them tests where they will overcome, hopefully, and in that way they can merit the future world. Those series of actions is called the Anhoga of Kiyum, the actions that God takes to fulfill the purpose of creation. The second set of actions is those actions which God takes as a judgment of what the person did. That's called Anhogas HaMishpat, the behavior or the conduct or the series of actions that God takes as a result of judgment. Yes, because if a person is tested, he has to do something. Well, obviously, there's always a result of his action. Judgment is the compensation for what a person did. Therefore, when God judges, what he's really doing is he's giving to a person the results of his actions. That is the second series of what God does. But then there's a third series or category of the actions of God. Besides to bring about the creation to its final plan, besides the action that God takes in order to give a person that which he did, that's judgment, there's a third series or third category, which is a very profound category. That is called the Anhogas HaYichud. It is the actions of the Supreme Being. What does that mean? Imagine that based on mishpat or judgment, it's up to the person. If a person has a life of mitzvahs, Torah mitzvahs, then he will get the future world. If he doesn't, then he doesn't get the future world. So therefore it's possible for a person not to get Olam Haba. Not only that, could you imagine if all mankind decided to sin? It is possible for the human race to thwart the plan of God. If everybody sins, then the plan of God, which is to have a community in Olam Haba, is what? Is frustrated. Therefore, what the Rebbe Hashem did is a very interesting concept. What he did is he now takes a series of actions that's called a backup plan, where the Rebbe Hashem takes certain types of actions that guarantees that the world has to reach a stage of shleimus perfection of tikkun. In other words, there's a guarantee built into the creation itself, notwithstanding the free will of man. There's a guarantee that the world must be redeemed, that the Mashiach must come. There must be an Olam Haba, and the Jews must exist, no matter what. We see this in Shemon Esrei, because it says, Umevi Goel, that God brings a Redeemer, the Mashiach, L'ma'an Shemoi, for His sake. What does that mean, for His sake? Why does it say Umevi Goel? Because of what? Because of what the Jews did. And the answer is because whether the Jews bring the tikkun or not, there's a system that makes them do the tikkun. And somehow it jives with the concept of free will. But we don't understand how that system works. That concept of the Anhogas HaYichud, the guarantee, the backup system, is so profound that there is no living entity that has a clue of how that works. That's called the Anhogan Esteres, the incredibly concealed acts of God. And nobody knows how it works. The Malachim don't know how it works. We certainly don't know how it works. Only God knows exactly how it works. And that area of actions of God is the area called Sadik V'Raloi. Why do the righteous suffer? And Rosh V'Toivloi. Why is it you see sinners and evildoers, they prosper? The Anhogas HaYichud, when God acts in that way, we don't understand what He's doing. It's irrational. Because we don't see justice. We see sinners profiting. We see righteous people suffering. Nothing makes sense. But to God's way of thinking, this is the backup plan. In the end of time, it will be revealed how it works. But right now, nobody knows how it works. Therefore, we have three series of actions, or rather three categories, that the actions of God can be included in any one of these three. Those actions which create and bring about the fulfillment of the plan, those actions which judge and give a person retribution in terms of what he did, and those actions which will guarantee the survival and the continuity of the existence of the world, its intended purpose, which is tikkun, and the existence of the Jews in the future world. We now understand certain very important ideas. If this is the case, we now understand what Rosh Hashana is. Rosh Hashana is not a day of judgment per se. What it is different. The best way I can explain it is, imagine a business. So some guy opens up a business January 2nd. What does he do? Well, he tries to make money. He sells, he's got a product line, he's got marketing, right? He's got accounting, he's got a lot of inventory. He's doing a lot of things to make money. A year goes by. What does he do? He takes an inventory. What he does is he reevaluates his business. He wants to understand exactly, first of all, how much did I make, how much did I lose? And why? Did I have too much inventory? Did I have enough marketing? And so on. Did I borrow too much money? Whatever. But this is the concept called an inventory, or rather, it's an evaluation of the entire business itself. Of course, in the evaluation of the business, he can look at the individual workers. That's true. Did they or did they not do their job? But it's not a judgment, or it's not an evaluation on the workers per se. It is an evaluation on the workers per se, or rather workers, in the context of the evaluation of the whole business. This is the same concept with Rosh Hashana. What Rosh Hashana really is, it's not so much a judgment on the individual people themselves, although it involves that. What it is a judgment on the whole Bria. What the Rosh Hashanah looks is what? Is the Tikkun HaKloli. Where are we standing? Are we near this Tikkun, or are we further away? Did the Jews bring the world closer to this rectification? Or did the Jews fail, and as a result of that, there's a great deal of damage that they did, and therefore I have to readjust? So what Rosh Hashanah really is a business inventory. It's a reevaluation of creation, the whole thing, to see what is the level or the status of the tikkun at that time. And it's a readjustment that based on what the Rosh Hashanah sees, he then readjusts. What does that mean? Well, he says, well, the Jews did not do a good job regarding this area, therefore I have to change. I may have to take the Jews and move them to another country. And over there they will be tested in a certain way that will force them to rectify that which they didn't do the year earlier. So we see major shifts in Jewish populations. We see nations rise and fall because the Rebbe wants them to go into another nation. So maybe the Rebbe will give tremendous economic prosperity to that nation, so the Jews will migrate there and do their avodah there. The whole world is nothing more than a stage for the Jews to do tikkun. And this is judged on Rosh Hashana. It's a global evaluation. It's an evaluation of the tikkun HaKoli itself. Of course, each Jew is judged in terms of what did he do in that tikkun. What was his contribution? Or what did he detract from this tikkun? Yes, of course it is. But it's a global judgment. Very important idea. This is what happens. Now, if that's the case, what do we have to do with this? Why is there Rosh Hashana? If the judgment is on ourselves, it's one thing. But if the judgment is on the whole Bria, on the whole creation, so what we should experience is the following. Is the Rebbeinu Shalom in and of himself decides what the status is. He doesn't have to tell us what he's doing. Really? But the answer is that the Rebbeinu Shalom went Lifnim Reshus Hadin. What he did is he informed the Jews that I'm going to make a general assessment of the entire creation to see what the status of Tikkun is. Why did the Rebbeinu tell the Jews? Because he wants the Jews to influence the verdict. The verdict of the entire creation, not merely the verdict of themselves. Because if a Jew does tshuva, so it could be that the Rebbeinu says, well, you did tshuva, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you, not only will you live, but I'm going to place you in a different category within the range of your neshama, what it can do, in another area. So therefore, it's a chesed that the Rebbeinu told the Jewish people that is what about to happen is a tremendous assessment so that they can influence the actual outcome of the assessment. This is what Rosh Hashana is, and this is a tremendous chesed that the Rebbeinu did, because he wants us to influence the verdict. He's giving us a chance that if some way we failed and therefore we have corrupted the creation, we have set back the tikkun, he wants us to do tshuva not only for ourselves, but to move the entire creation forward. That's what he wants. And that's really what Rosh Hashana is all about. It is a reevaluation and therefore a readjustment in terms of the entire program of creation itself. We now understand several of the questions that I asked and answered beautifully. What was the first question? First question I ask is, every Jewish holiday is tied to a historical Jewish event. We don't find that Rosh Hashana is. And the answer is something very fascinating. It is. Because what's the greatest historical event of the Jew? When he left Egypt? No. The greatest historical event of the Jew is when he took over the task of Adam Rishon. Who was the first one that was able to do tikkun? In fact, who was the first one that had to do the tikkun? It was Adam, the first man. Unfortunately, he failed. But the task of Adam was to bring God back. And had Adam Rishon not eaten from the tree, then he would have been the Mashiach. And he failed. That's why he had to give David HaMelech 70 years, because since he was not the Mashiach and could bring God back, then let David HaMelech do it. So therefore, when Adam failed, then who took over the job of Adam? Who is the ones whose soul is able to do a tikkun of the Bria, the rectification of creation? And the answer is the Jews. Therefore, the concept of Rosh Hashana is tied to the fundamental being of the Jew, because we took over the job of Adam. That is the connection between Rosh Hashana and Jewish history. Is that it's on that day when Adam tried to do the tikkun and failed, we took over that ability to do tikkun. That is our connection to Rosh Hashana. It's the connection not to an event in the sense of something happening to the nation, but it's a connection to all Jews that they became the substitute of Adam Rishon. I asked the question, what is the essence of Rosh Hashanah? And the answer you understand now. It's not so much a Yom HaDin on yourself. It is a Yom HaDin, so to speak, or an evaluation on the entire creation in terms of where is the tikkun status of the world. This is what Rosh Hashanah really is. The third question I had asked is, if it's a Yom HaDin, why does it happen once a year? It should happen every day. And the answer is that if it was a Yom HaDin on you, it would happen every day. In fact, Chazal says that there is a Yom HaDin every day. But this isn't a Yom HaDin on a person per se. It's a Yom HaDin on the entire Bria. So you cannot have a Yom HaDin, a judgment day every day. Because what the Rosh Hashanah does is he adjusts based on his evaluation, but he's got to give it time to work. It's like a business. You can't evaluate it every day. You can micro-evaluate, but you can't macro-evaluate. You got to give whatever things you put into place. You got to give him a chance to work. So therefore, the Rosh Hashanah allows it, or he does it once a year to see if that which he did the previous year will it work or not. That's why it's once a year. Makes a lot of sense. And that's why Rosh Hashanah is time-driven, not event-driven. Because it's not a judgment on the Jews' acts. It is an evaluation on the entire tikkun status of the world. So God wants to see at that time what's the story. That's why it's time-driven, not event-driven. And we also understand why Rosh Hashanah why the Judgment Day or this evaluation occurs on the first day of Tishrei. Because what is Rosh Hashanah really? Aleph Tishrei. Aleph Tishrei, what happened? Adam Rishon was created. Not the world, because the world was created on the 25th day of Elul. Adam Rishon was created on the 6th day, which is Rosh Hashanah. And on that day began the Tikkun. That was the inauguration of the whole plan. So we know that in yearly there's an annual evaluation. Well, if the plan began on Rosh Hashanah, guess what? Then the next Rosh Hashanah, the next Yom HaDin is also Rosh Hashanah, because that's its annual time period. Makes a lot of sense. Therefore, Rosh Hashanah is once a year on the very day that the Tikkun started. It was inaugurated on that day. And we also understand one more question, and that is why everything is judged. Because it doesn't make sense. Those things which have no free will, why should they be judged? But the answer is they're not judged in the sense of, are you guilty or not? Everything is judged because since the entire world is assessed and readjusted, then everything has to be judged in terms of what is its place in the following year's a program of Tikkun by the Jews. We don't realize that, but if there's a locust, if all of a sudden there's a swarm of locusts that comes over some nation, that's part of the adjustment process. If a nation finds oil, that's part of it. Every single thing that happens to anybody is part of the readjustment. But many things that happen to many things that happen to creatures have nothing to do with its guilt. It's because it has to be evaluated or adjusted. Where does it have to be in order for the tikkun process to continue through the Jews? Therefore, everything is judged. Some things are judged in terms of culpability. Did they do a job or not? Most things are judged, where do they fit? That's what they are judged. Therefore, that also makes sense. However, it's very interesting. I had mentioned that what the Rosh Hashanah did is because there's a global evaluation, what he did is a tremendous chesed. He told the Jews he's going to evaluate them. That's what he did. It's a chesed. So we can influence the verdict. But there's a big problem. What is the problem? I will tell you. If the Rebbe Hashem would evaluate it by himself, fine. It's his business. He'll go into his own private chambers, wherever that is, right? And he'll do his evaluation. And he can do whatever he wants. He's not to tell anybody. But once the Rebbe Hashem is mafasim, he publicizes to the Jews that you're going to be what judged. And therefore you should do tshuva, and so on. So all of a sudden, that calls into into operation Bezdin to see did the Jews do tshuva or not. But once you call the court of law, called a Bezdin, called a heavenly tribunal, then automatically you've called in the greatest enemy of the Jews, the Satan, the Mekatre. Because whenever you have a court, you always have a prosecuting attorney, and you have a defending attorney. So once you have announced it to the Jews, and there is a judgment as a result, then automatically you've called in the Satan. But that's very bad, because we don't want to be in facing the Satan. The Rosh Hashana on one side did a tremendous chesed, benefit for us, kindness, that he told us to do tshuva because he's going to assess it globally. He wants us to what? He wants us to try to influence the verdict that's going to happen in terms of the global progress. But the case is that once he did that, what happens is that the Satan is called in. Because then it becomes reviewed, or it comes under the jurisdiction of a Bezdin. And a Bezdin, a court, always means the Satan. So it's almost like unwittingly, God has placed us at the mercy of prosecution. And the Rosh Hashana knows that. So what is he going to do? How could you do an act of chesed to somebody that in the end turns out to be the worst thing you could have done to the person? Because we don't want to face a prosecuting attorney. So the Ribbono Shel Olam does a tremendous thing. What does he do? He says, don't worry, I'm going to stop the Satan. But how? And the answer is shofar. Shofar, the secret of the shofar is that it stops the Satan. Stops the Kitrug. Why? One of the important ideas about Hanogas HaYichud, or those acts that God does to guarantee the rectification of creation, is that it gives us a new form of avodah, task. How does the Jew bring a tikkun? How does he rectify the creation? What does he do? Well, he does mitzvahs. But if a person doesn't do enough mitzvahs, then what does he do? What about all the sins? So he does tshuva. So the first path to tikkun is what? Is mitzvahs. But if there's not enough mitzvahs, then the second path to tikkun is called what? Is repentance, tshuva. But what happens if a person doesn't have enough mitzvahs and he didn't do enough tshuva? So then what happens? So the answer to that is the Ribbono Shel Olam institutes a third mechanism or vehicle of tikkun, and that is called yisurin, or suffering. Suffering is also a method of tikkun. Yes, but it's obviously something that we would not want to choose initially. But in the end, if it's the only way, fine. So suffering is a path to tikkun, even if it's what? B'di'evid, which means secondarily. What is shofar? When the Jews blow shofar, you know what they're really saying to God? They're saying to the Ribbono Shel Olam, listen, we are now in the court. We're facing the Satan. We don't want that. We want to enter the private chambers that you go into when you perform what's called the Hanogas HaYichud. When you come up with the behaviors that does what? That guarantees creation. Nobody understands what you do. But we'd rather go there than face the Satan. So we are asking you to leave the courtroom of Mishpat, of obvious judgment, and to go into the chambers of Yichud, to go into the chambers that you go into, that is unbelievably concealed and mysterious. We want you to go there, and in that courtroom, you do what you want with us. Because we know that in that courtroom, in those chambers, which is a guarantee for our existence, we will walk out okay. It may be hard. There may be suffering involved, but we're going to walk out okay. There may be a lot of crying involved, but in the end, we will exist. That's what the Jews ask. Shofar is a plea to God to move from the courtroom of Mishpat to the courtroom of Yichud, to move from the courtroom of the Satan and the prosecution, and to move to the courtroom of the concealed acts of God that fundamentally guarantees the Jews' existence, and that the world will have a tikkun and there will be a Mashiach. Because even though it may involve suffering and crying and weeping, but at least we know we'll survive there. With this guy, we're not going to survive. With the Satan, we're not going to survive. So the profound mystery of shofar is that it's a plea to move out of this courtroom and to move into the chambers that God goes, so to speak, when he judges the universe in a way which is incomprehensible. That's what the shofar does. It's interesting that you see that for every chesed the Rosh Hashanah does, he always makes sure that it's a chesed shlema, that it's shalom, it's perfect, and that we're not harmed. So the concept of shofar is that it's a plea to move out of this courtroom and into the other one, and the Rosh Hashanah does that. As soon as he hears the shofar, he's out of this courtroom, and he goes into another courtroom. If that's the case, we can now answer the other questions. Let's go back. I asked the question, how do we celebrate Rosh Hashanah? We're sitting there with a Seudah, celebrating it. This is called Yom Adin, and the answer is because of shofar. That's why we can celebrate. It's like somebody rigs a jury. He pays them off, he buys off the jury. So he knows that he's going to walk out innocent, or he will not be found guilty. So therefore, it's okay. He's not worried at all. He paid off the jury, things are going to be fabulous. And that's it. He's not worried. Yeah, he's got to go through the motions of judgment. But he knows since he bought off the jury, he's going to be exonerated. The same idea. The reason why we call Rosh Hashanah Yontif is because fundamentally we cannot lose ultimately. That's the problem. That's the point. That in the end, God will save us, will exist, and we will exist in the future world. Or maybe Goel, the man Shemoy be Avo. Avo. That God brings a Redeemer, right? For his name's sake. And that's Yichud. Be Avo out of love. Because he loves the Jewish people. Therefore, we're not concerned. Therefore, Rosh Hashanah, which in face value is a Yom Adin, is really a day that we are guaranteed existence. That's why. And that's why the Malachim said, listen, if it's such a day where the Jews know that they're going to be saved, they say, why not sing Hallel? So Boshim says, no. Because to sing Hallel, it has to be complete joy. They have the joy that they know they will survive and be in Olam Haba. But listen, they're still in a court of law. And there's a Satan there, or whatever is going on. There's still anxiety, even at a low level. Because it's a very tense situation. You cannot say Hallel in such a situation. Hallel can only be said with an unmitigated, uninhibited joy. But if there's a restriction, if there's something that stops part of the joy because it's a very nerve-wracking situation, no Hallel. But Simcha, yes, but no Hallel. So we see that the answer that Rosh Hashanah says is beautiful, and we understand what their question is. And now we understand the tefillas of Musaf. What are we trying to do? We're trying to plead to God. What are we trying to plead? We're saying like this, listen, you've given us a chance to influence the verdict. Fine. We will do tshuva. What is the essence of tshuva? What is tshuva really? What is tshuva is to regret that which I did. But what is the real regret? The regret and the real tshuva is to say, listen, you are the king, not me. Because what is the real conflict? Who's the boss? Is it God? And therefore I have to do what he wants? Or is it me? I'm the boss and I can do whatever I want, which is a sin. So therefore the concept of melech is the essence of tshuva. That's really what it is. Therefore we say psukim verses that declare God as king. Because that's tshuva. You're the king. That's tshuva. That's the first plea. You know, it's interesting that there's a Kotzka Magid, used to say a lot of very powerful statements, very sharp. So he once said, listen, don't forget, it's important to proclaim God as king of the world, but don't forget to proclaim him king over yourself also. That's what he used to say, you know. But in any case, that's what the first set of pleas is. The second set is, well, if you don't find that we're doing enough tshuva, then I'll tell you what we should do. Then maybe we'll be able to survive in the judgment. How? Because remember the merits of the forefathers. Remember what the Akedas Yitzchak, what Noach did and so on. Maybe based on the merits of the forefathers, maybe based on that, we can survive. So that's a second plea. If I don't have enough in me to survive, so remember who my fathers were. They were righteous people. So maybe on their behalf I can survive. But what happens if that doesn't work? And that's what we're doing. Musaf is the series of pleas. So to try to do tshuva is one, Malchus. The second set of pleas is what? Is to remember what God, to remember what our forefathers did, the Ovis. But what happens if that doesn't work? So the third set of pleas is what? Is shofar. But until now, what does shofar have to do with plea? So what if I mention that the shofar is blown at different times? Why is that a plea? What does that have to do with Musaf? And the answer is because it is a plea. It's the last plea. What it says, if we didn't do enough tshuva, repentance by declaring you melech, if the schus, the merits of the forefathers isn't sufficient, so we blow shofar. What we ask is, listen, Rosham, leave the courtroom of Mishpat and go into the courtroom of Yichud, where only you know what you do. And even though we don't understand it, and it's irrational, and even though it looks completely contradictory, we don't understand what it means, and even though it involves Yisur and suffering, better there than to sit in front of a prosecuting angel that wants to kill us. That's what shofar is. Shofar is a plea. That's what it is. And that's why it's the third series of psukim that are in the Musaf. We also understand what shofar is. That it's a plea to go from mishpat to yichud. To go from judgment in the eyes of the court to judgment in the eyes of God, using it as a backup system, as a guarantee. And we now understand why the Satan is confused. Of course he knows on Rosh Hashana there's a shofar, but he's hoping that the Jews will not blow shofar. And if they don't blow shofar, then the God does not move out of that courtroom. Exactly. In fact, the Gemara says that in a city that does not blow shofar, it will be very bad for the Jews in that city. Why? Because they have not entered the third set of pleas. So all of a sudden when the Satan hears the shofar, he's confounded, he's frustrated, he's angry, because he knows what's going to happen. He's hoping that the Jews will not blow shofar. But when they blow shofar, what happens? God gets up, and it's okay, this is ended. And the Satan realizes that he lost, and he's terribly confounded and frustrated, because God now moves out of the courtroom or the presence of the Rosh Hashana into a different chamber which is completely concealed, but whose objective is the ultimate survival of the Jewish people, Idam Habor, and that there will be a tremendous tikkun. And we now understand why shofar has cries, why the blasts of a shofar, why it resembles crying. Because that's essentially what we're saying. Shofar is a plea to go into the other chamber, and in that chamber the primary way that God uses is suffering, and that involves crying. So what we're saying is, listen, even if you have to relate to us in a way which will make us cry and give us suffering and is incomprehensible, better that than to face the prosecuting attorney. Therefore, the blast of a shofar is crying. That's the concept of shofar. So, I've answered almost all the questions, but there's only one question left. Why does God move from one courtroom to the other? So what? So he blows shofar. So therefore, because of that, he gets up and walks out? Why? What's the merit here? Because the Jews say, do us a favor and move out of this courtroom and go into the other chamber, which is where you will save us. So what? You ask a judge, please dismiss the charges, or something like that. The judge's going to listen to you? Of course not. There's got to be merits to the case. So the question is, what is the merit that the Jew has that the shofar works? That is the question. And the answer is a very important idea. The answer is the Akedah itself. Yes. The binding of Yitzchak is the answer why the shofar works. That's the merit that we use. And because of that merit, the Rosh Hashanah goes out of this courtroom of Mishpat and he goes in the courtroom of Yichud. But what is the merit? Avram Avinu, imagine. The Rosh Hashanah approaches Avram Avinu and he says to him, I want you to take Yitzchak and I want you to slaughter him in the place I will show you. Could you imagine that? What was the test of Avraham Avinu? What was the problem here? Well, imagine, Avraham Avinu is human. Could you imagine what went through his mind? First of all, how could I kill anybody? Because Avraham Avinu is the quintessence of chesed, kindness. How can a man whose entire body, whose entire personality is filled with loving kindness, because we know Avraham Avinu, the chesed, the achnas ochem, the love that he had for people, anybody. How can a person like that do an act which is pure cruelty, to kill a person for no reason that he deserves? First test. Second test, the Rebbeinu Shalom. The Rebbeinu Shalom has tremendous chesed. How can God ask me to do something where the Rebbeinu Shalom never does that? The Rebbeinu Shalom is the greatest Baal Chesed. So how can a God that has such loving kindness ask me to kill this person? Third problem, third test, is that Avraham Avinu understood the true worth of man. He abhorred human sacrifice. So he said to himself, how can I have a human sacrifice? He understood the worth of a human being. Fourth sacrifice, that Yitzchak was his son. How can a person take a son and kill him? And the fifth test is that Yitzchak was the last Jew, because there's no other Jews, there's just Yitzchak. So in effect, Avraham Avinu would be killing the last and only Jew other than himself left. Can you imagine that? And this is running through his mind. But there was one more test, the sixth test. And that was the greatest test of all, and it is something that is staggering to Avraham Avinu. What was it? Remember, Avraham Avinu figured out that there was a God at 3 years old. Avraham Avinu is a brilliant mind, brilliant philosopher. He understands, he proved the existence of God, and why he is and what he controls and so on. So we're talking about an incredible thinking man. What is the greatest test to a thinking man? I'll tell you. When a person sees God do something, it doesn't make sense to him. For instance, a person sees that God kills, let's say, children or whatever. It doesn't make sense. Why? What they do? But the truth is that the answer is unknown. But it could be justified with some idea. But I don't know what the idea is. So that's a test that you have to trust that God has a reason. Except I don't know it. So I have to have faith in God. I have to trust in God that there is a reason. That God is not capricious. Or just doesn't do something as a whim. There's a true reason. Except I don't know what it is. Fine. So I will suspend my judgment. I will assume I don't know, but God does know. Fine. That's one kind of a test. Those are difficult tests. True. But there's one test that is impossible to overcome. You know what that test is? I will tell you. It is a test of complete irrationality. What does that mean? Where God says one thing and completely contradicts himself in the next statement. That's impossible. Because Hashem Elokechem Emes, God is a God of truth. And if God created logic in this world, then he must abide by that logic when he talks to us. Therefore, when the Rebbe says, Ki v'Yitzchak yikol chazora, that in Yitzchak will be what? Will be your seed, means that the Jewish people will continue through Yitzchak, right? That's what he said. That is a divine prophecy, that the Jewish people will have continuity through Yitzchak. That's emes. That's a fact. That's a reality. So when God says, I want you to kill Yitzchak, that's an impossible statement. It gives lie to the first prophecy. That cannot be. It is completely irrational. It cannot be. That type of a test, even a philosopher will buckle under. Therefore, Avraham Avinu could contend with the others because he didn't know the reason for it. So fine, I don't know the reason. I will trust God that there is a reason. But the problem is, on the last test, there is no reason. It is a logical impossibility. Therefore, God is presenting himself to me irrational. In other words, to kill Yitzchak, and that Yitzchak should be the continuity of the Jewish people, is what's called in logic, it's mutually exclusive. If one exists, the other cannot. And if this exists, this cannot. They cannot exist at the same time to a human being that is rational. Therefore, Avraham Avinu had to say to himself, this is incredible. This is impossible. The God I know is a God of emes. How could this be? This is what Avraham Avinu said. Now, we know what the real answer is. Because the Baruch Shem never told them to kill Yitzchak. He said, V'ha'aleu le'olah, and bring him up as a korban, but not kill him. Therefore, to God's understanding, it was possible. There was no logical contradiction here. But Avraham Avinu didn't know. He figured you bring a guy up to an oilah, you kill him. He carried it through. So to him, of course, then God wanted him to think that way. So to Avraham Avinu, it was impossible. So here's Avraham Avinu, the incredible intellect. He does not grapple with this. God is irrational. What do I do? So Avraham Avinu, in whatever time it took him, probably was an instant time, because that's how great he was. He said, listen, I don't understand this. It's not only that I don't know the answer, there is no answer, because it's logically impossible. So therefore, I don't know what to do. But one thing I know, there has to be some way out of this. That the Rebbeinu Shem is that kind of God where it is not possible that he is illogical. So he said, I'm going to do it anyway. I don't care. To my mind, it's impossible. But I have to trust God that he is not irrational. Even though what he just told me is absolutely irrational. That's the greatest test of all. Because Avraham Avinu has to bystand something which is impossible really to bystand. But he did it anyway. So he took, of course, he took Yitzchak up, and of course in the end he realized what the error was that he made. That Hashem never intended, he didn't violate his promise. Don't kill him. And the Malach says, don't kill him. What was the meaning of that? And why is that the last test? In all the 10 tests of Avraham, that was the last. Why? Because the Rebbeinu Shem said to him, La'asid lavoi, there's going to be a judgment, there's going to be an evaluation and a readjustment. And I'm going to tell the Jews that they should do tshuva to influence the verdict. But all of a sudden, it's going to throw it into a court of law. What are they going to do? I'm going to give them shofar. And shofar is where they're going to tell me to go into the other room and judge mankind. But wait a minute. In that room, that's the room that I take actions that I want, that guarantee. But the actions are irrational. They don't make sense. Yes, they don't make sense. It's Sadik Varaloi, Rosh V'Tovloi. It doesn't make, even Moshe Rabbeinu couldn't understand this. And it wasn't Moshe Rabbeinu because he didn't know the answer. It was irrational. That was the problem. Or else there would be no real question. Just trust God and that's all. But the truth is that the Baruch Shem said the following: because you are Avraham Avinu, you withstood the test of an irrational command. In that merit, when the Jews will ask me to behave toward them irrationally, and that's my private chambers, I'll do it. Because you stood the test of irrationality, of a mitzvah that was irrational, illogical, mutually exclusive. In that schus, they can ask me to go into a room and conduct a series of actions which appear completely irrational, and I'll do it. What's the merit? Because you succeeded. You didn't care if it was irrational. Therefore, they have a right to ask me this, and I will do it for them. Therefore, the Akedah is the exact concept of the shofar. Because the shofar represents the request to go into the private chamber, the Anhagas HaYichud, which is irrational, in the sense that it's completely unintelligible. In fact, when Rabbi Akiva, there's a famous Gemara, where the Malachim, where there was a story, but in any case, the main idea is that they looked at Rabbi Akiva, and this man was so incredible that he was expounding on the crowns of the letters that even Moshe Rabbeinu had a hard time understanding. So the Malachim were overwhelmed. What an incredible person. So they said to the Rebbeinu Shem, show us his end. This person must have an incredible end. So the Rebbeinu Shem showed them the future, Rabbi Akiva, that the Romans would take his skin, the back of his, in the back of his skin, or the skin on the back, and rip it to shreds. So the Malachim said, this is incredible. They said, Zu schora v'zu what? Zu Torah v'zu schora? This is the man's Torah. This is the reward? What was the problem here? The Malachim couldn't understand. It was Anhagas HaYichud. This isn't mishpat. This is completely irrational. How do you take a man that is the greatest man in Klal Yisrael, that has Torah that even Moshe Rabbeinu does not understand, and do this to this person? This is what the Malachim said to the Bosham. Zu Torah v'zu schara. This is Torah and this is reward. It's impossible. What was their question? We don't understand this. But we know what department did this go under. It went under Yichud. So what did the Bosham say? He said, listen, if you ask me again, the whole creation goes into tohu, goes into chaos. What was God doing? Threatening the angels? No. He said them very good. He said, listen, I cannot tell you the answer to this. It must remain irrational to you. Because if I tell you the answer, then the Satan will know the answer, and then I can't do the guaranteed backup system. And therefore the world cannot survive, and it will return to chaos, because the Jews cannot survive. The only way they can survive is if I do actions which are irrational, that nobody understands, even the Satan, and that's how I can save the world. I cannot reveal this. But it's interesting that even the Malachim was stunned by this action which is pure Yichud, Rabbi Akiva's death. But the Jews, what did they have? The Bosham gave this test of irrationality to Avram because he knew in the end the Jews would have to ask for that. And the merit of Avram Avinu's passing the test is the merit of the shofar itself. That is why we read the Akedah on Rosh Hashana. That is our merit. And that answers the final question of why it works for the Jews and why Akedah is so critical. And we also understand what the test of Avram Avinu really was and why it was absolutely mind-boggling that he did it. What do we see from all this? We have a whole different understanding of Rosh Hashana. It's a global assessment. It's a readjustment. Look at the chesed that the Bosham does. He wants to influence the verdict. But the real truth is that we have a task. Look at the world we live in. The whole concept of Yom Adin is anti-America. Because America doesn't believe in absolute values. You can do whatever you want. That's the whole concept of American behavior. You do something? Well, he's got a problem. There's no right, there's no wrong. There's no right, there's no left. There's no moral, there's no immoral. That's what many people believe in America. That's why there's such a corruption in America. But Yom Adin means, there are absolutes. There's a right and there's a wrong. There's a correct and there's an incorrect. That's the first thing Yom Adin says. And the second thing Yom Adin says is that there's an accountability if you don't do that which is right. That's what it says. What a difference between the way a Jew looks at life, the way a Jew looks at what? At religion, and the way Goyim look at the way they understand. They can do whatever you want, it doesn't make a difference. But within that, there's a tremendous amount of chesed. And the ultimate chesed is that the Bosham says, even if you get stuck in the court, I'm going to get you out of it. This then is the concept of Rosh Hashana. It is a day of awesomeness. Why? Because it's not you on the stand alone. It's everything in creation is being judged to see what's its status or its station. And one of the interesting things is that if you would judge yourself, so fine, so that God would say you're not guilty. But if you are judged within the context of creation and you do tshuva, it's possible that God will elevate or promote you to a different place in the tikkun. Yes, because God can do anything. Because what's being evaluated is the tikkun itself. Therefore, if a person's a tzaddik, if he does tshuva, so Bosham says, listen, until now this was your task. But I'm promoting you. You're going to become vice president. I'm going to take you and I'm going to make you famous. Or I'm going to make you successful. I'm going to make you wealthy. And God can do whatever he wants. Why? Because within the context of creation, I want you to have a higher calling. And he could do that. Because the decision, because the evaluation is the evaluation of the whole project. And therefore, the outcome is the outcome of where you will fit in the Tikkun HaKloli itself. Therefore, it is very important to do tshuva on Rosh Hashana. Because it's not only that you walk out b'din, zakai b'din, if you do tshuva, but besides that, you can literally alter and change the station of life. Because the Baruch can do whatever he wants. Because since globally it's an evaluation, therefore you can be changed on a global scale. Where God says, aha, I am now going to move you into an arena that you haven't even dreamed of. This is a very important concept of Rosh Hashana. Fine. We have now understood a holiday in a whole different level. But it's very interesting. We now understand with one answer the whole concept of what it really is. Look how many questions it really answers. Therefore, think about that when you enter Rosh Hashanah. That the whole world is going to be reassessed, you're going to be reassessed, the Jewish people. And that depending on how you behave, that will depend on what your station is. Not only life and death, but what your station is in terms of the ultimate tikkun itself. Therefore, I want to wish everybody ksiva chasima tova, and that everybody should do tshuva to such an extent where that God will say, listen, the tikkun hakloli is finished, and therefore it should be tafshin samach dalet, which is tiyeh shnas seif dvorim. This is the end of the matter, and that's it. And the Mashiach finally comes this year, and all of us then will have a murdik gula she'el shlema. Thank you.
Rabbi Kessin, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much for your inspiring work. Yeah. So since you convinced us all that Rosh Hashanah is a reassessment of where the tikkun is, since tomorrow is September 11, what is your assessment? I know it's past 1 o'clock for you, so maybe we can do it briefly.
It's 1:16.
Once, all right.
The truth is, I mean, in a very, very briefly, 9/11, September 11th, is one of the, in many ways, one of the greatest moments of all in Jewish history. Why? Because we enter with 9/11, we enter the last stage of creation. That's really what happens. Why is that? Because Klal Yisrael, in its journey throughout what it has to do, has many protagonists, and the last protagonist, the last great enemy of the Jewish people, is Ishmael, the Arabs. And what the Baruch Hu has done is that he has accelerated the process to enter the last stage where the last great enemy of the Jews are the Arabs, are Ishmael. In fact, it's interesting because the date of 9/11, whatever the Baruch Hu does, is always a siman, a remez. It's always interesting that the date of 9/11 in 2001, the Hebrew date was Chof Gimel Elul, Tofshin Samach Aleph, and if you add that up, I think it's 852. That's the exact gematria of Bi'ito Achishena. In its time, I will hasten it, which obviously refers that God will hasten the coming of the Mashiach. It's also gematria Bozeh, with this, Bias Mashiach ben David. This will bring the Mashiach ben David. That's always, I find, very interesting. And therefore, the Baruch Hu is accelerating the process of the last Tekufa, where Yishmael is the last great enemy. Why is the last great enemy? You'll have to wait till I get to Los Angeles. But this is fundamentally what it is. And in that sense, hopefully we can look into the real beginning of tremendous good news in a very short amount of time.
Amen. Anybody want to ask? Go ahead.
What do I have to go to?
No, just go ahead. Ask. There's another question. Go ahead.
Yes.
Hi. First of all, the Yasher Koyach on your talk. We all really enjoyed it. It was very enlightening. And of course, a good gazuntior to you and yours. And regarding what you said about the shofar bluesing distracting the Satan,
Confounded, yeah.
This coming Rosh Hashana, the first day, is on Shabbos. We don't blow the shofar on Shabbos.
So then what happens? That's your question.
That's my question.
Okay, the answer is what Chazal say. Chazal tell us that we cannot blow shofar on Rosh Hashanah, which falls down on Shabbos, because they're afraid you may carry it and so on. But the gentleman asked a very powerful question, because if shofar is really a plea, so if we don't blow shofar, there's no plea. So God's going to stick us in the court of justice, and what are we going to do? But the answer is that the Torah itself provides the answer. Solution. Because the Torah refers to Rosh Hashana in two places. One place it says Yom Teruah, a day of blowing, right? Which means you have to blow shofar, and we know what that does. But the second place, it doesn't say Yom Teruah, a day of blowing. It says Zichron Teruah, a remembrance of blowing. So the Torah said, what do you mean remembrance of blowing? If you blew, why is it remembrance? So there you clearly see that God is alluding to what will be 1,000 years later. That the rabbis will say, you can't carry, and therefore we are going to mention the sukkum of shofar, and that will be a remembrance of the shofar we used to do last year. And that is sufficient. So therefore we can, the plea works one of two ways. Either it's Yom Teruah, where we blow shofar, or it's Zichron Teruah. It's a remembrance of Teruah, and therefore merely to recite the sukkum of shofar works the exact same way, and the Torah tells us that. In fact, that's one of the reasons why the rabbis knew that they could actually stop the shofar, and still the Jews will be protected.
Thank you, Rabbi.